in an independent Scotland. I don't think that that anybody needs to be informed of the way in which the media has treated Scotland forever. And Craig and I had the pleasure of being involved in the making of a London Calling about the BBC bias in the referendum in 2014. So we have some very qualified people to speak about it. So Craig Murray and Iain Lawson, and then David Henry. So about 10 minutes each, we give you an expose, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So why don't we begin from right to left, and go ahead, Craig.
Oh, yeah, you can. If you could sit, it would be better.
Yeah. Right.
I shall sit and relax in that case, as instructed. I was asked to join in this session at the last moment because somebody else dropped out. So I must confess I have a very prepared thing to say to you this afternoon on Scottish sovereignty and international law. But this morning I am winging it. I think I was invited on the grounds of my well-known ability to talk apparently fluent nonsense on more or less any subject at the drop of the hat. So I will give you some reports which aren't backed by. I haven't come here with research and statistics for you. So I will make up some statistics. The first statistic isn't made up, and that is that approximately 50% of the Scottish population support independence at the present time. That's fairly well established. The second statistic is made up, it's an impression, but I don't think it's very far wrong. Is it not remarkable that in a country where 50% of the population support independence, about 5% of the journalists support independence? And I don't think that 5% is very far from the truth. And certainly, if more than 5% of journalists do support independence, then they are forced to hide it by their employers. Because the entire narrative of the media in Scotland is entirely anti-independence. How has that come about? Why are there so few columnists and reporters who support independence operating in the Scottish media? I recently saw an exchange by Andrew Neil on Twitter where he was denying that the owners of newspapers have an effect on the political stance of the newspaper. And he said that in his entire career, he had never been told by a proprietor what to write. And I imagine that may well be true, but the answer is that the proprietor has never needed to tell Andrew Neil what to write, because he is a man of dependably Tory opinions. And it takes me back, of course, to the famous exchange between Noam Chomsky and Andrew Marr, where Andrew Marr stated that no one was telling him what to say, these really were his opinions. And Chomsky replied, I have no doubt that is really your opinion, but the fact is, if you had a different opinion, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. And that is how the media works. The media, there are basically two forms of media in the UK, of what I might call legacy media. There is the state-owned media, which reflects the views of the British state. And there is the commercial media, which reflects the views of the owners of the commercial media. Neither of those groups of people tend to support Scottish independence. The state, obviously, has an interest in perpetuating the state, and the extremely wealthy people who own newspapers have an interest in perpetuating the status quo on the grounds that status quo made them extremely wealthy. So the lack of radicalism, of original thought, is, if you like, built in to the media system. It's not a byproduct of the system, it's how the system operates. There's the tiny exception of saying that the decision was made that because so many people support Scottish independence, it may be commercially viable to have a single newspaper of small circulation supporting Scottish independence, which we have seen with the the national, but that's really such a small section of the market, it doesn't affect the overall question significantly. And this media bias against independence is something we have to live in with day in and day out. The unionist slant of the newspapers is simply a given. But obviously, at election times and during the referendum, it becomes particularly acute. As Martin was mentioning, during the last independence referendum, it isn't just that all of the corporate media was entirely biased and pro-unionist, but it was. It's also that the BBC was entirely biased and pro-unionist. And who can forget famous items like the Gavin Isler Vote No Borders propaganda broadcast, where there was a 5-minute segment at the start of every single news bulletin all day, given to an organisation, a grassroots organisation called Vote No Borders, which apparently was terribly important in the referendum campaign, which was against any barriers between Scotland and England, and which didn't actually exist. It had no relevance. It never did exist. It was purely a company registered by a London PR agency belonging to Lord Offord, now the Tory peer. And Gavin Isler must have known. He cannot have made that segment without knowing he was lying and knowing that this grassroots organisation did not actually exist. But, that was a deliberate lie by the BBC. And one thing which infuriates me is every time I see the 2014 referendum referred to as a gold standard. It was not a gold standard, it was an appalling travesty of democracy. In which of democracy in which one side of the argument was hopelessly disadvantaged by the continual media propaganda in favour of unionism. And one thing which I have always advocated, which I do hope will happen if we ever get another referendum as such, is that the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe be called in to its Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights based in Warsaw to monitor the media and produce a report on the fairness of the election. Because that is absolutely essential. There needs to be looking forward, and actually moving to what I'm supposed to be discussing, looking forward to an independent Scotland. And what will be the position of the media in an independent Scotland. I should say I am not by temperament inclined to the idea that state regulation is the answer. I don't think state regulation is the answer. I tend to be rather libertarian in my views in general. And having the state tell newspapers what they can and can't publish seems to me very seldom to be sensible. I think the answer is to tackle the corporate agenda and tackle newspaper ownership and to break up concentrations of newspaper ownership and to empower community-based journalistic organisations and to empower the new media. I must confess, I was absolutely horrified when the Scottish Government, not even a sleight of hand, the Scottish Government openly came out and said it was assisting the newspapers during COVID by placing adverts and providing £3 million worth of subsidies to the Scottish newspapers to keep them going. If you put that kind of money into the alternative media, you don't have to give it all to me, but some of you know. If you put all that kind of money into the alternative and community-based media, I could see a point. But providing the legacy media with yet more money from the taxpayer in order to promote unionist propaganda was simply infuriating. I also would like to, and this is one last point, which may be controversial. I don't want to see the BBC Scotland continue after independence in the same kind of form it is now. And by that, I mean that having a state broadcaster beholden to the Scottish government as opposed to a state broadcaster beholden to the Westminster government is only a kind of improvement. I don't want a state broadcaster putting out government propaganda full stop. And the question is, if the BBC did not exist as that kind of organisation, in today's media climate, would you necessarily want to invent it? Does the state need to own a broadcasting platform? That's different from saying, does the state produce some content that can be broadcast? And that's different from saying the state can and should promote the arts, promote culture, provide grants for the broadcasting of information and materials for the public. But should there actually be a monolithic state broadcaster as such in an independent Scotland? No, on balance, I don't think that's a good thing. And I think it's something we should be thinking about doing away with. I would say, if Scotland were independent tomorrow and I were First Minister, which I've done is extremely unlikely, quite possibly my second act on independence, after I'd abolished the monarchy, my second act on independence would be to send P45s to everyone at BBC Scotland. Except for the technical, industrial and catering staff. Everyone else, just clear them out. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, like Craig, I was a last minute substitution with a big 12 in my bag. And I thought, well, what should I do? And I thought, well, what would be quite interesting, and nobody else in the panel could probably do it, is look back at the media and where we've come from. Because when I first got involved in politics in the 1970s, and I know you're probably looking out there and saying, can't possibly be that old. But I actually went to a very politically active nursery school. I'm not entirely convinced you'll all believe that. But some of the statistics, and I've brought some statistics to you, just for a bit of contrast. In 1982, there was a newspaper study in Scotland, and they found that 84% of Scots read a morning paper. And that compared with about 75% of people in England and Wales that read a morning paper. 451 out of 1,000 people bought a morning paper, which tells you that they shared their paper with others to get to the other figure. 271 people in England bought a paper, to get to their figure. Purchases of Scottish newspapers were 1.4 million copies, that's of all the Scottish titles, and that compared with about 491,000 for UK titles that were being sold here in Scotland. 68% of Scots read the Sunday Post, that's where the Bruins fame came, and 54% read the Sunday Mail. So armed with this information, I thought I'd go away and have a look and see how they're doing these days. And in those days, back in late 70s, early 80s, the Daily Record sold 750,000 copies a day. Today it sells less than 70,000. So the first question I've got is, why do we pay these media so much importance? They're a fraction of the importance they were 40 years ago. If the Daily Record went against you in the 70s, everybody in Scotland knew the next day. The Daily Record can say what it likes these days, and it'll get out. I don't know, Craig's blog, but my blog is out every morning, and it's got a circulation comparable with the National. I'm a one-man operation. But I'm out there contacting round about 10,000 people every morning. You know, I would argue I'd probably get more say because unlike people that buy the National, maybe only to read the sport, they're reading the article on that blog, the political article, so the impact's greater there. So I think the first thing we need to recognise is the media is not as important. The newsprint, TV media, is not anywhere near as important as it was 30, 40 years ago, or as influential. But there's also an interesting story that happened in my lifetime as well, because in the 70s, the newspapers were quite unionist. There's a surprise. Yeah. But in the 80s, there was a determined campaign, once we were pushing for devolution, to try and put pressure on the newspapers for them to be more open to the idea of devolution. We started that in the early 80s. And by the end of the 80s, every publication in Scotland, every major publication, was in favour of devolution. And the reason they went that way was because they were all losing readers. And the threat of being seen to be anti-devolution was to cut off even more of your existing readers. Now, all I'm saying to you, it doesn't take a genius to work this out. The newspapers are much more vulnerable today than they were then. And 50% of Scots support independence. So I think we should be much more aggressive with these newspapers. Instead of giving them £3 million or £9 million as they hope this year, we should be saying to them, listen guys, you know, we'll let you away with it long enough, but unless you start opening up your columns and be much more balanced in your coverage, we're going to recommend the people that support independence to stop buying any of your publications. Because hoping to convert these newspapers to independence is a waste of time. They've got no intention. The only thing that will convince them they're going to be more open is when it starts hitting them in the pocket. And we should be hitting them in the pocket. I mean, it's no surprise that across the world political campaigning always ends up in the most effective ones are boycotts. Because boycotts do a whole range of things. A, it brings supporters on board because it gives them something to campaign on. B, it intimidates whoever your opposition is. And even if they're not, they don't immediately give in. They certainly pull back from doing anything that would provoke it and make it worse. So I think we just need to play a bit more cleverly, be a bit more revolutionary, and I'm sure we'd have a much better outcome than what we're currently experiencing. As for the BBC, they're a complete waste of space. You know, we're never going to be able to convert the BBC over because they're using our own money to gather propaganda in their houses against what we believe in. So the way around that is definitely one payment. And it's much
BBC on the phone.
It's much no quote.
Reverse charge.
Exactly, could be. But I mean, streaming now gives us availability of media worldwide. You can sit in your front room and connect to any news or media outlet in the world and watch their programmes. So in the days of the BBC and state control of media broadcasting, that's over. Absolutely over. And we should be an independence movement, the first to recognise that, and then to put it to good use and say, no more, you can go and put out whatever you like about us, we don't rate you. And all I'll say to you is this, the head of the SNP's communications is Murray Foote, who was the architect of the vow and the editor of the Bureau Record. Here's a bit of news. He was editor for 4 years. I just looked this up out of interest. In the 4 years, he halved the circulation of the Daily Record in a 4-year period. So he's now busy in the SNP and from what I hear, half of the membership now. I'll pass on to David.
I just wanted to ask a question before we went to David. It seems to me as if when you look at the big media organizations, News Corporation, Murdoch, all that, they make so much money off, you know, kind of more entertainment, sports, all that they can afford to lose all kinds of money on the actual newspapers. So it's almost like they're not even subject to market forces because, you know, because we can talk about, yeah, we're just not going to buy them, but they're subsidized, you know, as loss-making because they are so useful in the propaganda, even if there's not so many people that actually read it. But, you know, the BBC has their newspapers now, Sunday mornings, and they, you know, so even though nobody buys it, it still sets the agenda in a way. Like,
I don't know if people remember when the Sun came out in favour of independence. You know, and I was in the Sun offices that night. This will surprise you because I was quite heavily involved in convincing the Sun that they should do this. And Jim Sellers was in as well. In fact, I've got a framed copy of the second paper off the run, signed by the editor Bob Bird and political editor Andy Collier at the time. And it's quite a good story. They had to convince Rupert Murdoch that it would be worth doing. So both the Scottish editor and I mean, it was a clear plot to get by the record directly to supported independence and becoming the #1 paper in Scotland, and it worked. We did very quickly shortly thereafter. But board, Rupert Murdoch's board was meeting in Australia, and they had to come along and do a presentation, and they got a pipe band. And just halfway through this board meeting, the doors swung open and in came this big band. You know, in Australia, giving it absolute loudly. And at the end of it, Rupert bowed to their demands and said, okay, go ahead. But it was a tactic to build their circulation. They were second to the record at the time, and that was what they needed to tip themselves.
I'm sorry, what paper was this again?
The Sun.
The Sun.
Yeah. It lasted for a few years until, just so you know how things are fiddled, it lasted until Rupert Murdoch needed Tony Blair's support over DSB, and the deal then was that Labour insisted that the Sun dropped independence in Scotland. So that's the way the world works, you know. And we need to be as ruthless as that, going the other way, and that's the bit that's lacking.
Thank you. David.
Just give you a little bit of background apart from me running around with cables and stuff. About 21 years ago, I ended up buying a television channel, as you do. I'd written a business plan for a digital TV service. Digital was brand new then, it only just launched. And I saw that that was the future of broadcasting. So I'd spent, a good year and a half wasting time in meeting rooms with investors and ad agencies to try and find out if they would advertise and all this, all of it. And then one day, I sold my first production to a channel called Rapture TV, my student production, and it got broadcast. So that put my name out in the trades. I then went down to see MTV Dance and proposed a series in Ibiza. I went out with my own money, on my own for weeks on end. It was absolute hell. Actually it was, but it was sunny. And when I started filming and interviewing big name DJs and all this clubs and stuff. Anyway, to cut a long story short, while I was out there was billboards everywhere outside, all these giant nightclubs. They're huge, right? Massive businesses with Rapture TV all over them. I thought, my God, that's amazing. Turns out I get a phone call from one at MTV. Rapture's gone bust. They've pulled all their staff back, right, which is right enough. There's nobody on the island from Rapture. Anyway, I got back and I thought, it's gone bust. Oh, if you scored that email on that business plan and got one, put that on instead, it's the perfect fit. So, cut a long story short, I managed to buy it, eventually from the receiver, and relaunch it. I recruited about 10 staff. We made in-house shows. I went to all the program markets, licensing the programs. I had battles with Murdoch. We could get a few stories about that. I'm the only person in this building, in this country, that changed case law. So I took, on my own, I don't recommend using lawyers, so I didn't use any, which shocks the lawyers. And I fought Sky B and Ofcom, the regulator, to get Sky Sports 1 and 2 supplied at a regulated price. Of course, they thought they were dealing with some village idiot from Scotland, who, what would he know? He's not a lawyer. He was up against QCs, lawyers, you name it, and Ofcom, all Christ, the court was full. 6 months of battles, we finally get the hearing in front of a High Court judge and President of the Competition Appeal Tribunal. And the lawyers are sitting down the front, and I travelled all the way from Scotland with a ginormous suitcase with 60 kilos worth of paperwork in it. And I get down there, and I've got everything. I've researched Murdoch's, all his businesses, found where all the money came from, kept asking them, what does B Sky B Malta 1 Limited do? And B Sky B Malta 2? And B Sky B Malta 3? They don't broadcast in Malta, they haven't got any subscribers in Malta. No. And they shut the companies down every time it's time to publish the accounts. Oh. Follow the money. Anyway, so this is where I get my experience from broadcasting. So I ran the channel for about 1.5 years, 2 years. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never had any holidays. We made our own shows. One of the things that I found most enlightening was being able to get people who had talent, real talent, that had never been given an opportunity to make anything, but they were working in other channels. And of course they could come to us, and on the same wage as being a production assistant at MTV, we would make them a producer, and they would start making a program. Well, the programs were bloody good. They were really good, and they were so talented and creative. So this gets me on to the research I've been doing for an independent broadcaster. So I'll give you a couple of facts. I also fought against Ofcom granting a licence to the BBC Scotland channel, because, as pointed out, it's been touched on before, media ownership is extremely important. If you own a media outlet, or multiple media outlets, more to the point, like Murdoch, or the BBC, then you can influence public opinion. You can run a completely false story about a grassroots group called Vote No Borders that was registered in London by a bunch of Tory supporters who didn't publish any accounts and then got fined afterwards. I reported them. I said, you can't be, you're not Scottish. Because they claimed they were registered in Edinburgh. I went, no, I've done research, you're registered in London. Called up the Electoral Commission, pointed out, yes, but it's fraud. It's complete fraud. They're asking for money, and they claim they're registered in London. They're registered in Edinburgh, but they're not. They're registered in London. So who are they? I go, so the Electoral Commission and the press started investigating, and they researched them and found out I was right. I said, and by the way, you can't transfer your company from Scotland or London back again. You have to register it in either Scotland or in England and Wales. You cannot transfer the company to registration. So it says, so this is completely fake and false. You need to do something. You're quite right. The one thing that shows on that day in 2014, the BBC knowingly and deliberately ran that story. Now, it took me 10 seconds researching to know it was a fraud, that it wasn't real. They ran it for 24 hours a day on every single media outlet channel. Another thing they did, which you may remember, I think the day before the referendum in 2014, they took blethering together. Now this was new to me, this is creativity, because it's apparently a documentary. A series of documentaries blethering together, answers to the humorous questions that you might want to ask about independence. Well, what's humorous about it? So it was meant to be a joke. And then, but this tells you that we were living in state-sponsored propaganda, and it cannot possibly have been an accident. They started running it every half hour on the BBC News channel the day before the referendum. At the bottom of the hour, they cut off from their live news, and they ran blethering together again. And then they did the same again, and over and over and over again. This isn't an accident. That's not how television works. You know, it's not one button pressed by accident. Somebody planned that. They thought, oh God, they're going to win. Quick, throw everything at them. So it gets me back to why the BBC is an extremely dangerous organisation. About 12 years ago, this is part of my research from our court battle, I used to research Murdoch. You know that, don't fall off the stage. We've run out of insurance claim forms.
all us.
There we go. We've got another thing just about to kick off around the corner. So, media ownership. So my complaint was the BBC wanted permission to have another channel. And its proposal was it was going to do news, as we now know, it was going to do the 9 o'clock news. A whole hour of news, stroke current affairs. It already has 42% market share of news and current affairs in Scotland. In 2008, Rupert Murdoch was refused permission to buy the remaining shares of BSkyB because it would mean he would have a 10% market share in the supply of news. 10% was deemed far too high against the public interest because it can damage public opinion because one person or one organisation can basically influence the news agenda. So if it was against the rules, against the public opinion for 10%, then now, for 42%, that is also against the public interest. So, going forward, Scotland needs an independent broadcaster. There's no great secret here. In Ireland, they have an independent state-funded public broadcaster, RTE. It's quite well thought of. It has a budget of nearly €400 million a year. It has a TV licence, but it also has commercial revenue. In Ireland, you also get the BBC services. In Northern Ireland, you also get the RTE services. They have a cross-border agreement. Scotland should do the same. Scotland can have its own public service broadcaster, which of course will get priority listings on your channel guide. The BBC will be shuffled down the bottom somewhere, but you'll still be able to watch it, if that's what you want to watch. If you're a big fan of EastEnders, you can understand their accents. Good for you. So I suggest that the public service broadcaster is going to be a quite different model to what the BBC is. Its budget would be about £400 million a year if everybody paid a TV licence, even though we all happen to think we might have to start with that, but I think we should move immediate changes. It should not be a criminal offence. People on income support and universal credit and single parents should not be being forced to pay £157 a year. So we should make sure that it's available to all. But on top of that, we need to look at things like Channel 4. Channel 4 is a very good model of what a public service broadcaster can look and sound like. They're still a bit biased towards Scotland because they're based in London. But they don't make their own programmes. They commission them. Nearly all their programmes are made by independent producers. I happen to think Channel 4 News is probably the best that I've seen. But it's still got a London bias. So, the proposal for a public service broadcaster, if I was drawing it up, one, you base the regulation on the European regulations of television without frontiers, because this comes to something that's even more important, it's not been touched on yet. The Human Rights Act and the protection of human rights from Europe includes television without frontiers. And that was designed so that people in France can watch German channels, people in Holland can watch Greek channels, people in Greece can watch something else. In Italy they can watch non-stop game shows, which is what they do. We're a member of that. People might not know, but Ofcom is one of the easiest places to get a broadcast licence. Currently there's about 1,200 television channels licensed through Ofcom. They're not all for Britain. They're mostly for Europe. So we should be basing ourselves going forward, I believe, on the European regulations for television without frontiers, which embeds in your human rights freedom of expression. And that means you don't want a state-controlled broadcaster pumping out anything. And the way to stop that is you make sure that your regulation says new broadcaster will make more than 50% of its content through independent producers. Its news and current affairs will also be from independent news producers. So you will have different programmes. Think at the moment like a replaced BBC Newsnight. Think that was made by a different company. right, not the BBC, then it would have a different editorial stance. It would not lead the first night on Jeremy Corbyn with a hat on that made him look like a Russian. You know? I mean, that's what the BBC did. And in the future, we would not have every single news broadcast with the same stories across all the different platforms, all controlled by the same media organisation. You would have different stories. Different stories deemed to be more important by some sections, so you could have, I mean, the BBC try it. There's Women's Hour, and I have tried listening to it actually. But it seems to be getting really, they must have covered all women's problems by now. That's my thought.
Women on the panel right now.
No, well,
Jeremy Paxton once said, why don't we have men's hour? And they're deciding,
yeah, no, well, I'm getting,
Jeremy, every hour is men's hour.
I take that on the chin. My main point was that while the BBC have, if you like, ghettoised Women's Hour, and that's what I'm really criticising, is the fact that they've got an hour just for women, and therefore, and it's also the same problem we've got with Gaelic programming with BBC Alba. They've ghettoised the minority. So that's what my point is.
We're actually the majority, David.
Yes, but my point is in broadcasting, it's mostly women that work there, and yet it's not women that are represented.
Are you talking about BBC Alba or Women's Hour?
Well, generally across the BBC. There's the people, most of the producers are probably women, most of them. And yet, but the commissioners, some of the commissioners are women, but that's not what you see on screen. So somebody's, the people that are higher up than them that decide what it's getting made, it's not the women that make those decisions.
We live in a patriarchy.
Yeah. So the way to solve this dilemma, in my view, is to have a new broadcaster set up who's required to be minimum 50% to independence. So there's only up to 50% made in-house. Its funding model has to be quite different. The BBC TV license days are numbered. It's a very old-fashioned system.
It's a regressive tax.
It is. But we'll have to phase out of it. But the world's moved on. Broadband providers. I just want to know, how many people have got broadband at home? Nearly everyone. Well, I know the average is £20 to £30 a month. How much do you think those broadband providers pay towards the public service broadcaster? Nothing. Yet they're making money out of it. So if you're using streaming to watch content, or you're going onto the BBC website, or the Guardian website, or any other newspaper website, and you're using broadband to do it, the broadband providers make money out of it, but doesn't pay a penny towards any of the content. I would propose that should change. That the broadband provider must pay a monthly fee to the public service. So human rights expression, limit of ownership. Scottish broadcast, Scottish media, a majority of the shareholding should be held in Scotland. At the moment, most of the channels that you're watching are owned by Americans. But it doesn't matter which brand you're looking at. Channel 5, it's an American channel. It's owned by Viacom. So, and they don't make anything here hardly at all. So they're not investing in original content. So we should have a broadcaster that's similar to Ireland, mixed finance model, make sure that part of the employment contracts ensure that people are from Scotland, maybe insist a second language has to be spoken, which will rule me out straight away. But I think if you want to support Scottish language, then you make sure that people can speak Scots, or they can speak Gaelic, and if not, they go on a course, and if not, they're fired. And that's enough for me. Any questions?
I just think an interesting follow-up for the
Microphone.
room is
Microphone.
how many people actually pay their BBC license fee?
not a criminal offence in Scotland.
I would just ask, do we need to wait for an independent Scotland?
Enter your house is the
I mean, Ireland has it now from what I understand.
services. The police can't even get in without warrant. So remember that, you can't get in. No way.
Okay, go ahead and rephrase your question.
Hi, I hear you saying an independent Scotland, but do we need to wait for an independent Scotland given such an important position that the media have? Is there no way around creating one now instead of waiting for an independent Scotland?
Well, it's something I was working on. The local TV broadcaster, the licenses, don't know if you've watched it. It's now called Scotland, but it was STV2 quite a few years ago. And I did approach STV2 to say, because we heard they were going to close down. It was one of the risks of a BBC Scotland channel being licensed, is the BBC, well, it was quite clear to me, and that's one of my complaints that I put in, it was likely to damage competition in the marketplace because the BBC already had 42% market share. You're going to give them another license. They're going to throw, I think it's 32 million a year is the BBC Scotland channel's budget. My God. Rapture TV ran on £700,000 a year. And yet the BBC Scotland channel. So it's a different animal. But still, £32 million a year is. STV2's budget was 2.4 million. It had advertising revenue of 1.3 million a year. So its gap, it was losing about £800,000 a year. They wanted to continue it, but because this new channel was coming, that was going to have 32 million a year pumped into it, and do news and stuff, STV2 couldn't possibly compete, so they pulled the plug on it, sold it off for a pittance to somebody they already had an exclusive agreement with, so I didn't get a look in. If that had gone ahead, you would now have an independent broadcaster.
Oh.
But the world has moved on, so to answer your question, with what do we do now? There are things being talked about right now about creating a Scottish broadcaster that would start out streaming 24/7 on YouTube. That only gets you a certain percentage. So you need to be on all platforms. The older generation, the over 50s, which is the typical BBC audience, and the typical no-goer, is beyond 50. So the people you want to reach, if you want to convince them about independence, is actually the people that are watching the BBC. So while we might have all switched off, and I have, I don't watch it anymore. But you know what? I'm not going to get any news from Netflix or Amazon Prime.
No.
I'm not going to get any Scottish-made programmes on Netflix or Amazon Prime. So while everyone talks about it, and they have got a significant market, Netflix, over 49% of Scottish homes have a Netflix subscription. So if you could get a channel via there, you'd be connected immediately to 49% of the homes. So there is a way, but it takes money. We've done this conference has been done on shoestring. You know, 3 full-time volunteers and a few folk that now come into help. It's extremely difficult to make it work. And there's no way that you can keep going like that for a very long time because you'll end up in hospital. So, especially if you trip and fall off the stage. So my answer is yes, there should be something done. I think if there's creatives out there, they need to be writing stuff in Scots language. One of the secrets, this is a lesson from Indie Live, I think they've done a great job of keeping independence in the forefront. But, here's the but. Everything they do has a very limited shelf life. It's live. It's the lesson I learned from Rapture. Our weekly shows were great. How long were they valuable? 1 week. Because the next one came out next week. So that's what you want to avoid, is making shows and programmes that are only valuable now. And next week nobody wants to watch them. Football, live football is a perfect example. It gets huge audiences and people will pay for it. So a public service broadcast in Scotland should have live Scottish football on it. That will guarantee you an audience. But its value is only valuable until the whistle's blown. Because then you know what the result is. So why would you bother watching it? You know? So so my there's a programme currently being done via Indie Live, the Scottish Food Show. I don't know them, but I've watched a couple of them. It could be turned into a really good programme, but it's made because it's streamed live. It doesn't need to be streamed live. It can be recorded and made and recorded, and then show it whenever you want, and then show it again and again and again. Most of the TV you watch is recorded. You know, it's not live. We need to start thinking about making programmes that we can show whenever we want and in the future. So we can, but it needs some money.
Yeah, next one here.
Oh, just
So just the switch.
Oh, just a quick point on the bias of the UK media. Recently we've seen Mick Lynch of the RMT on the news making fools of all the mainstream media journalists. It was quite evidently noted that after he'd done that and made fools of them on Question Time, he was basically sort of cut off the air and you didn't hear anything of him.
Well, of course. I mean, would you want someone that makes you all look like on your programme? Of course, that's what they're going to do. I actually did. I did follow it, and I thought he was doing fantastic. But wait for the Sunday papers; they're going to dig up some dirt on you before you know it. You'll be plastered everywhere because they can't argue with the message. They won't, so they'll attack the messenger. But I think they've made a big mistake. You know, the world's moved on.
I think one thing I find fascinating is the very, very strong popular support that Mick Lynch has got from his appearances, which of course is why they've cut him off. But that residual understanding of the need for working people to be able to better themselves and not put up with continual tax cuts, continual cuts in working conditions, so continual wage cuts in real terms and continual cuts in working conditions. There's still a strong understanding and support for that. And the fact that the Labour Party has abandoned it, and the Labour Party is sacking front bench spokespeople for appearing on the picket line in a highly justified industrial action, is one reason why so many people want Scottish independence, because Scotland was deserted. The Labour Party that ran Scotland for so long deserted the working people, deserted the working class. And that desire for a more equitable and just society remains the basic dust behind the desire for Scottish independence, in my view. I'd also just like to question about paying the TV licence. I haven't paid the TV licence for very many years. And I used to get the letters addressed to the occupier. So I used to forward them on to the Israeli embassy. Unfortunately, about 2 years ago, they changed them to saying the legal occupiers.
Hi, just an observation on BBC Scotland's budget. This was a story told to me by Norrie Hunter, who I think used to work at the BBC. It was about Eggheads, the TV quiz show was, don't know if it still is, but it was made in BBC Scotland studios in Glasgow and fronted by Jeremy Vine. And the story he told me was like, so Jeremy Vine is paid whatever he's paid, like £1 million a year, for example. Well, probably not sure of that, whatever. But actually, so he would come up and shoot Eggheads for whatever it was, 2 weeks or whatever. 2 weeks worth of his £1 million salary would come out of the BBC Scotland budget.
Exactly.
Because they were making the programme. So probably just the cost of him fronting the programme was more of the budget than all the other people, the technical people and everything else combined. So when they do talk about X million pounds is spent in Scotland, it doesn't actually mean what it says.
You're absolutely right. Now, in 1999, I went to Wales, the Celtic Film and TV Festival, right? I was researching for a TV channel. So I paid my fees and drove down there. And I remember having a drink, those drinks after one of the similar thing to this. And anyway, I'm standing there chatting away, the network and stuff. And this quite posh English accent chap saying, so yes, and he goes, I don't try to understand what all this Celtic thing is about. Right? You're at the Celtic Film and TV Festival. Anyway, so we're chatting a bit more. I said, so, excuse me, what do you do at the BBC? Well, I work at the BBC. Oh yes, what do you do at the BBC? Oh, I'm script editor for Monarch of the Glen. Oh, right. Well, it got better. I said, have you ever been to Scotland? Oh, no. Right. Do you know what? I think I'd be perfect as script editor for EastEnders. And he still didn't get it, and I walked away. But to answer your little bit there, right? So it goes on all the time. The BBC's, yes, they get about £380 million a year. It's raised for the TV licence. Hence why I said if we had an independent public service broadcaster, we'd have about 400 million. They spend fortunes on certain things, which can be done much, much cheaper and save a small fortune. So, and there's a thing called lift and shift. Lift and shift is, so the BBC Scotland's got an annual budget. They're meant to make so much in the nations and regions. So what they do is on paper, they transfer X amount of money to the Scottish nation as our region, and they say we must make lots of programmes. But what actually happens is just what you described. Eggheads, which is a UK production, so it's for the whole of the UK, it's not a Scottish production, but it happens to be made by BBC Scotland in BBC Scotland studios, a bit like Mrs Brown's Boys, that's also made in BBC Scotland studios, but it's for the UK network. So what happens is all the real money ends up staying in London. They commission it in London. They'll get the producers lined up, probably in London. They'll bring most of the crew up from London. They hire most of the equipment in London. That's right. And they travel all the way up to Scotland. And catering. Yeah, all that. So it does create lots of jobs, just not for anyone in Scotland. And that is what you have to ensure doesn't happen in an independent Scotland. We need programmes here for our audiences. But one thing I want to say. I've heard people talk about Scottish culture and all that. I don't have a hugely strong Scottish accent because I spent so much time in London. It's an advantage, especially in broadcasting, or it has been. So I think we need to ensure that we look outwards. We don't make things that are inward looking. We take our culture and we make it and we put it out there for a global audience. One of the most successful programmes, products, and that's what most content is, it's a product, is Outlander.
Yeah.
Outlander it costs over $1 million an episode. So it's got a movie-style budget. And it's made by Sony Pictures Television Distributed, and it's made for the Stars Network, and it's sold all over the world. And hundreds of millions of people are watching it every week. And it's made a fortune. Made a whole new industry in Scotland. You can now come to Edinburgh and get an Outlander tour. They'll take you in a bus as a tourist, they'll take you to all the locations that they've used, where they film things, and so it's a huge advantage. Brings massive amount of tourism as well. Scotland must stop thinking about itself as an independent little country. It's not a little country, it's a great country. It's a great country with a huge history. And the wonderful thing about Outlander, it's linked to another show that was one of my favourites as a child, Doctor Who. The writer of Outlander was a historian. She used to write historical books. So she was a historian. She's come up for her 40th birthday. She's getting old, her friends in California told her, you need to do something to celebrate your 40th birthday, you know. They said, you need to write a novel. You should write a novel, a fiction, a novel. Oh, I've never written a novel before. What would I write about? Well, a historical novel. So she's thinking about this next. Oh, a historical novel. That's an interesting idea. but when in history? Anyway, she's watching PSB, the public service broadcast for the States. PBS, that's it, yeah, PBS. And on there is an old black and white, late at night episode of Doctor Who. And it's all in black and white, so it's back in maybe in the 60s or 70s. And a wee Scottish guy comes running and he's being chased by a wildebeest or something. And bursts through the TARDIS into the door and finds himself in this figure on the inside. Right? And she saw that and she fell asleep. And she woke up the next morning and thought, Scotland? That man wearing a skirt. All about Scotland. What? Oh, that sounds interesting. I wonder whether it would be an interest so she's a historian. So she starts researching Scotland's history.
Yeah.
When would be an interesting time in Scotland's history? Well, it turns out that's exactly when it starts with the red coats, when we're being bludgeoned to death and everything stolen and pillaged. So not a lot's changed. So I need to wrap up. Outlander should be made by the new Scottish broadcaster or something just like it. We should be selling it around the world, and we should have our own global app so that you get your own Scottish public service broadcaster with your live football on it. You pay £1 or £2 a month for your app. You can watch anywhere in the world. Think of it as a Scottish Netflix.
Or a percentage.
Thank you very much. We can break for lunch now. We're back here at 3:30. Let's make it 3:30 sharp so that we can stay on schedule for the rest of the day.